She accepted $1 million for one night, but what the millionaire didn't expect was to fall in love by stealth. The relentless beep of the monitors filled room 407, a cruel soundtrack marking every second that Mary Johnson spent there, feeling the weight of reality crushing her. Her mother, Susan Elena, lay in bed, her face pale and eyes closed, tethered to tubes and wires that seemed to hold her by a thread. The sterile smell of antiseptic and medication made the air suffocating, but nothing was more oppressive than the papers Mary clutched tightly in her hands. Medical bills that in total amounted to $37,000. An absurd figure. An impossible figure. Her heart pounded in her chest. How could someone like her, an exhausted waitress working double shifts, possibly scrape together this amount? She had squeezed every cent, worked until her bones ached, and given up any comfort just to keep her mother's treatments going. But still, it wasn't enough. The hospital wouldn't wait much longer. She ran a hand through her hair, tied in a loose bun, feeling the dry strands, battered by fatigue. Her mother struggled to breathe, and Mary leaned in a little, holding her mother's hand gently. Her fingers were cold. "I'll fix this, Mom." Her voice came out in a whisper, loaded with promises she wasn't sure she could keep. When she stepped out of the room, the bills still pressed to her chest. Her stomach churned as she saw the hospital administrator waiting for her in the hallway. Tall, in a grey suit with a cold expression, he held a clipboard with the same indifference of someone dealing with numbers, not lives. "Miss Johnson," he called without preamble. Mary stopped, trying to swallow the exhaustion and anxiety. "I know," she said before he could speak. "I'm working on getting the money." "We need more than just attempts," he retorted, emotionless. "Either you present an immediate payment plan, or we'll have to suspend the treatments." Mary felt the blood drain from her face. "Suspend?" Her voice trembled. "We can't keep a patient in intensive care without financial guarantees. We've already surpassed the tolerance period." "Please, you can't do this." Her tone was desperate, but the man didn't show even a flicker of empathy. "We can, and we will." He adjusted his glasses as if this was mere protocol. "If there's no payment, we'll have to explore other options." She wanted to scream, she wanted to cry, but instead she clenched her fists and lifted her chin, as if that firm posture could carry the weight of the world on her shoulders. "I'll fix this," she said, forcing each word out. She turned before he could reply, the knot in her throat growing tighter. "Fix it? How?" In the days that followed, her routine, already unbearable, became almost inhuman. In addition to the double shifts at La Plaza Café, she looked for any job that would pay in cash. She washed cars until her fingers were wrinkled, delivered food until the early hours, cleaned offices before the sun rose. Every penny went directly to the hospital account. But the amount she gathered was pitiful compared to what she needed. She barely slept. She lived on coffee and leftover bread from the cafe. Her muscles ached, her eyes burned, and every visit to the hospital felt like a reminder of her own helplessness. On that cold November morning, she walked through the doors of La Plaza Café, feeling as though she was walking in a bad dream from which she couldn't wake. The smell of coffee and fresh bread, which once brought her comfort, now only served to remind her that another exhausting shift was about to begin. Mary tied her apron, grabbed her order pad, and went straight to the counter, forcing a hollow smile. The cafe was filled with clients in expensive suits, women with designer handbags, and students desperate for caffeine. None of them seemed to know what it was like to fight for survival. Then he walked in. The atmosphere seemed to slow for a moment. A tall man with impeccable posture entered the door as if everything around him was irrelevant. His dark suit was impeccably tailored. His shoes shone as if they had never touched the ground. His hair was styled in a way that seemed casual, but clearly took effort. He held a phone, his eyes fixed on the screen, and his air of superiority made it clear that he was someone accustomed to being served, not serving. He walked to the counter and stopped right in front of her without looking up. "Double espresso, extra shot," he ordered, his voice carrying the perfect tone of British accented English. Mary blinked, too tired to care about the arrogance. "Please," she retorted, sarcasm slipping out before she could hold it back. Finally he looked up, and for a moment time seemed to stop. His eyes were a deep blue, studying her with both coldness and interest. Unlike other customers who merely ignored her, this man seemed to be assessing something. "Please," he repeated without an ounce of embarrassment. She sighed quietly and began preparing the coffee. "Name?" she asked, not looking at him. "William Harrington." She wrote it down without reacting, but the name seemed to send a small shock through the room. Some of the other waitresses exchanged looks, whispering. One even widened her eyes in surprise. Mary wrote down the name without reacting, but the movement around her didn't go unnoticed. The other waitresses exchanged glances, whispering softly. One of them, Rachel, widened her eyes and bit her lip, clearly surprised. Mary ignored it. His name meant nothing to her, and at that moment, the only name that truly mattered was her mother's, printed on the medical bills she carried like a cruel reminder of her financial ruin. "If you need sugar, it's over there," she said, pushing the coffee cup across the counter. It was then that, for the first time, William Harrington looked up and truly examined her. "How much is it?" he asked, his voice carrying a calculated disinterest. $7.50, she answered, trying to maintain her composure. He slightly furrowed his brows, as if he found it amusing to be dealing with such small numbers. Mary crossed her arms, impatient, as he pulled out a refined leather wallet and took out a shiny black card. She recognized the type. It wasn't just a credit card. It was a symbol of status. No limit, no restrictions. A free pass for any luxury money could buy, but instead of just paying and leaving, he hesitated. He looked at her again, as if he were trying to decipher something. "Are you new here?" he asked. Mary scoffed. Of course, he had never noticed. Men like him never did. 8 months, she replied firmly. "You just never noticed." The answer made him smile faintly, as though he liked the challenge. "I notice the things that matter." She let out a dry laugh and took the card to swipe it. "I imagine that must be a very exclusive list." "Extremely." The way he said it, without any effort to disguise his arrogance, only confirmed what Mary already thought about men like him. But to her surprise, when she handed the card back, he slid another, smaller card across the counter. "What's this?" she asked, not picking it up. "My business card." Mary raised an eyebrow, crossing her arms. "And why would I need that?" William tilted his head slightly, observing her as though he were enjoying himself. "Because I want to invite you to dinner." The shock made Mary blink a few times before letting out a brief, incredulous laugh. "You can't be serious." "I am." She looked around as if expecting someone to explain that this was some kind of prank, but no one seemed to notice the exchange between the two of them except Rachel, who watched from a distance with wide eyes. "I don't go out with customers," she said, pushing the business card back across the counter, "especially not ones who think everyone has a price." William didn't take offense, quite the opposite. His smile widened a bit, as though he was genuinely enjoying her resistance. "What if I told you it's not a date, just dinner? It doesn't make a difference. What if I told you I'm just trying to make up for my lack of attention over the past 8 months? I'd say you owe a lot of people a lot of compensations." He chuckled softly. "Maybe. But right now, I'm only interested in you." Mary looked at him with suspicion, trying to figure out why a man like him would be interested in someone like her. But before she could dismiss him for good, He leaned slightly over the counter and said something that made her stomach drop. "Everyone has a price, Miss Johnson. Yours is $1 million for one night." The world around Mary froze. For a moment, she thought she had misheard. But no. The words still echoed in her mind, raw and unfathomable. Her body reacted before her mind could process it, and her fingers gripped the counter with force. "What?" Her voice was low but heavy with disbelief. William maintained an impassive expression, as though he were discussing business. "You heard me." Mary's heart pounded in her chest. She opened her mouth to say something, to curse him, perhaps even to throw him out of the cafe, but the words got stuck in her throat. $1 million. The amount glowed in her mind like bright neon lights. $1 million meant that her mother would never have to worry about medical treatments again. It meant she would never have to spend sleepless nights scraping together change to pay impossible bills. But it also meant selling a part of herself. The bile rose in her throat. "You can leave. Now." William didn't move. He just watched her, as if waiting to see what her true reaction would be. Mary ripped off her apron and threw it on the counter, about to tell him to go to hell. But without realizing it, her fingers slid across the business card before her mind had time to reject it. William saw it and smiled. He knew that no matter how outraged she was, no matter how much she wanted to hate him, the proposal was now in her head, rooting itself like poison. Without saying anything else, he grabbed his coffee and walked out, leaving only that damn business card behind. Mary stared at it in her hand, her heart racing. And even though she knew she should throw it away, she slid it into the pocket of her apron. The weight of the card felt multiplied. Throughout the rest of her shift, her mind spun around one single question. How far would she go to save the only person she loved? If you're watching this far, I'm sure you're liking it, so I want to ask you to subscribe to the channel. The business card was still there, small, discreet, but heavy as lead on the kitchen table. Mary stared at that little piece of paper as if it were a death sentence. Beside it, the white envelope carried the final notice from the hospital, sealed with the red stamp that made her want to scream. The deadline was up. If she didn't pay, her mother would lose her treatment. She pulled the chair out and sat down, exhausted. The apartment in Polanco was small, with simple furniture and few belongings. The living room and kitchen shared the same space, and the only window overlooked a narrow street where car headlights cut through the darkness of the night. Mary held her head in her hands, elbows on the table. She needed $37,000. But William Harrington had offered her $1 million. The amount was too large for her mind to process. $1 million wasn't just enough to pay the hospital debt. It was money that would change her life. It would pay off bills, guarantee comfort for her mother, give her a chance to start over. But the cost. Her gaze returned to the card. She picked it up with trembling fingers, running her thumb over the name printed in gold letters. Below it, a phone number. A number that she knew, if dialed, would make it impossible to turn back. Mary dropped the card as if it had burned her. No, there had to be other ways to get the money. She had to find a loan, take on another job, sell the little she had. But how many months would it take to scrape together $37,000? How many exhausting shifts? And what if it was too late? She looked at the hospital notice, then at her mother's medical records. The doctors had been clear. The treatment had to continue without interruption. Any delay could be costly. $1 million. Her finger slid across the phone screen, opening the dialer. William's number was there, saved in her memory. She began to type it, then erased it. Her heart was pounding, and a thin layer of sweat formed at the back of her neck. Was this it? Was she going to sell herself for money? Mary closed her eyes. No. This wasn't about her, it was about her mother. That was when she realized it wasn't desperation driving her to consider this choice. It was hope. She took a deep breath and typed the numbers again. The phone rang. Once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th ring, he answered. "I knew you'd call." His voice sounded like silk through the phone. Mary clenched her teeth, her stomach twisted with hatred, shame, and everything in between. "I hate you," she whispered, her voice thick. There was a brief pause. Then William laughed, a low and satisfied sound. "That's not a requirement," he replied, amused. "Tomorrow, 8 p.m., Palanque Hotel." Mary couldn't say anything more. She just hung up. The phone fell from her hand, landing on the mattress as she sat on the edge of the bed. Outside, the city lights flickered indifferently. To the world, it was just another ordinary night in a place where everything had a price. Tomorrow, she would sell a part of herself to the devil, and there would be no turning back. The clock struck exactly 8 p.m. when Mary got out of the taxi in front of the Palanque Hotel. The revolving glass doors reflected the lights of Mexico City, creating a golden glow at the luxurious entrance. Her heart beat so loudly she could feel it in her throat, but her face remained impassive. If she was going to do this, she would do it her way. The black dress she wore was the only thing left under her control. The tight fabric hugged her curves with elegance. The modest neckline revealed just enough, and the long cut made each step echo confidence, even though inside she was falling apart. It had cost more than it should have, but she refused to walk into that hotel wearing anything that didn't feel worthy. If she was selling her soul, at least she wouldn't look broken on the outside. She took a deep breath before walking through the doors. The lobby of the hotel was imposing, with a massive crystal chandelier hanging from the vaulted ceiling. The white marble floor reflected the light with an almost artificial shine, and the air smelled of imported perfume and expensive leather. Behind the front desk, a concierge in an impeccable suit lifted his eyes as she approached. His professional smile didn't falter when he said, "Mr. Harrington is expecting you on the top floor." Mary simply nodded. There was no need to ask how he knew who she was. People like William had enough power to make sure no one questioned anything. A private elevator was called, and she stepped inside, feeling the steel doors close around her. As she ascended, she studied her reflection in the elevator mirror. Her expression was cold, her dark eyes impassive, but she knew the truth. She knew everything inside her was about to collapse. The elevator stopped with a soft jolt, and the doors opened into an absurdly luxurious suite. The ceiling was high, the glass walls offered a panoramic view of the city, and the furniture was a blend of sophistication and minimalism. But nothing there impressed her more than the man who was waiting for her. William was at ease. He wore a white shirt, the first 2 buttons undone, holding a glass with amber liquid, swirling it lightly before bringing it to his lips. When he saw her, he raised the glass in a silent toast. "You came." "It seems I did." She forced herself to maintain eye contact. She didn't want to give him the satisfaction of seeing her hesitate. William gestured to a dark leather sofa in the middle of the room, and on the glass table, a contract lay waiting. "Please have a seat." Mary walked to the table but didn't sit. Instead, she picked up the contract and began to read it. The paper was of high quality, the black ink precise, and each clause was written with legal coldness. 1 night, $1 million, no emotional involvement. She swallowed hard. "This looks like a business deal," she said. William smiled, leaning back to rest the glass on the table. "It is," he replied. Mary gripped the pen he slid toward her. Her name was already printed at the bottom of the last page. All that was needed was her signature. For a moment, she stared at him. William didn't seem anxious or impatient. He was relaxed, as though he already knew what decision she was going to make. And he did, because Mary had already decided before she even entered that elevator. With a trembling hand, she signed. The ink dried within seconds, but the weight of that signature would stay with her for the rest of her life. William picked up the contract, gave it a quick glance, then smiled, satisfied. "Congratulations." He stood up and walked over to her. Mary felt the scent of whiskey mixed with a woody cologne that was absurdly expensive. Her body tensed when he placed a light hand on her arm. "Now, you're mine for 12 hours. The words made her stomach churn, but she didn't react. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her tremble. William pulled his phone from his pocket and typed quickly. Seconds later, a notification sound echoed in the room. Mary looked at the screen of her own phone and saw what she had expected. The transfer had been made. $1 million. Her fingers were cold when she accessed her bank account and immediately transferred the amount to the hospital. In a few clicks, her mother was saved. The relief should have flooded her. She should have felt the weight lift from her shoulders. But all she felt was a terrifying emptiness. The price had been paid, and now it was her turn to be claimed. The luxury suite was silent, lit only by the city lights that filtered through the glass windows. Mary maintained a rigid posture, trying to ignore his presence while she stared at the distant skyline. But William was not the type of man who liked to be ignored. When he touched her face, a shiver ran through her skin. She turned sharply, grabbing his hand before he could go any further. Their eyes met, and for the first time that night, Mary saw something different in his expression. Curiosity, genuine interest. She pressed her lips together. "This isn't just a business deal for you, is it?" she challenged, narrowing her eyes. William tilted his head slightly, a small smile playing on his lips. "What makes you think that?" She laughed, humorless. "You look at me like you're waiting for something, but you've already gotten what you wanted." He took a step closer. Mary didn't step back. "Gotten what?" The silence between them thickened. The contract was clear. This wasn't supposed to be anything more than a transaction, but the way he looked at her said otherwise. And then it happened. The first kiss between them was a collision of pride and desire. William was not gentle, and Mary didn't give in easily. Their bodies met in a silent battle of resistance, neither willing to back down first. The heat of the moment consumed them in a way neither of them had expected. Mary realized too late that this wasn't just a contract for either of them. The morning light filtered through the thin curtains when Mary opened her eyes. The room was quiet, and William slept beside her, his breathing deep and rhythmic. Her chest rose and fell slowly, still processing the night before. She should feel relieved. She had done what needed to be done. The money was where it needed to be. But for some reason, everything inside her screamed that something had gotten out of control. She couldn't stay there. Carefully, she got up, grabbed her dress, and walked over to the glass table in the center of the suite. Her eyes fell on the remnants of the night, the signed contract, an empty bottle of wine, untouched glasses. Mary slid her hand into her pocket, pulling out the business card William had given her at the cafe. She looked at it for a moment before placing it on the table. Without another word, she left. 3 days later, Mary tried to move on. Life at La Plaza Cafe continued as usual. Coffee being served, clients in a hurry, the smell of fresh bread and espresso filling the space. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something inside her had changed. And then he showed up, not William, another man, tall, well-dressed, but with a different air, less refined, more aggressive. His smile was sharp, as if he already knew the impact his words would have before speaking them. Thomas Wilson. He leaned against the counter, watching her with amused eyes. "Mary Johnson, right?" She furrowed her brow, suspicious. "Who's asking?" Thomas chuckled softly. "William's business partner. I have to admit, he went too far this time." Mary felt a chill run down her spine. "What are you talking about?" He leaned over the counter as if savoring every second of the blow he was about to deliver. "It was a bet, you know?" Her heart stopped. "What?" Thomas smiled, pleased with her reaction. "William wanted to prove that everyone has a price. And you—" He made a vague gesture, as if tossing her aside. "Well, looks like he was right." The cafe seemed to go silent. Mary felt the world spin. The ground beneath her feet felt unstable. The air became heavy. No, this couldn't be true. What had happened between them? It was real, or at least she had thought it was. But now, standing there in front of this man, who smiled as if her pain was entertainment, Mary realized the brutal truth. William Harrington had paid $1 million to win a bet. What they shared that night, it was just a game. The worst part was knowing that for a moment she truly believed. She believed that William was different. Thomas leaned casually against the counter as if savoring her reaction. He took a card from his wallet and slid it over to her. "But look at the bright side," he continued, his tone heavy with amusement. "You proved you're valuable. How about a new offer?" It was quick. The slaps crack cut through the air, and the whole cafe fell into an absolute silence. The customers turned. The waitresses froze mid-service. The baristas stood still behind the counter. Mary was breathing heavily, her hand still raised. Thomas's face turned to the side, marked by the impact. He blinked, surprised. Then he smiled. "Oh, girl, now I get why he liked you." Mary felt bile rise in her throat. Her vision blurred. "Tell William he can go to hell." And then, without giving him another second of her presence, she turned and ran to the back of the cafe. Her legs could barely hold her up when she reached the small dressing room, locking herself in before anyone could try to follow her. The narrow walls seemed to close in on her from all sides. William Harrington had paid $1 million for a bet. The truth crushed her again and again until her whole body trembled with fury and humiliation. Her phone vibrated in the pocket of her apron. Her heart jumped in her chest. She already knew who it was, even before looking at the screen. William Harrington. Her trembling fingers hovered over the screen for a moment. Then, without hesitation, she blocked the number. If he thought he could explain himself, if he thought his arrogant charm could undo what he had done, he was wrong. William Harrington was a man who bought everything he wanted, but he would never have a chance to buy her again. The knocks on the door made her shrink against the wall. "Mary?" Nicole's voice was tense, worried. "What happened?" She couldn't respond right away. The tears she had been holding back silently streamed down her face, and her breath came in short, staggered gasps. But Nicole didn't wait. The door creaked open with a determined push, and her best friend entered, closing it behind her. Mary's eyes were red and swollen. She looked smaller, slumped against the wall, as if she was trying to disappear. Nicole knelt in front of her, holding her shoulders. "Mari, what did he do to you?" The question broke the last thread of resistance Mary had. The sobs exploded from within her, sharp, intense, tearing apart what little dignity she had left. Between fragmented sentences, she told her everything. William, the bet, the humiliation. Nicole remained still as she listened. Her eyes narrowed, her jaw clenched in a rigid line. When Mary finished, silence settled between them. Then Nicole took a deep breath and said, with an unsettling calm, "I swear I'll kill those two." There was a moment of quiet before Mary let out a weak, bitter laugh. "Get in line." Nicole pulled her into a tight embrace, saying nothing more. And there, in the arms of the only person who would never sell her out or toy with her feelings, Mary finally let the pain take over. That night was long. Lying on the couch in her small apartment, Mary stared at the ceiling without really seeing it. The faint light from the lamp cast soft shadows across the room, but inside her, everything was a violent whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. Shame burned like acid on her skin. She thought that night at the hotel had been more than just a contract. She thought there had been something real in William's gaze, in his touch, in the way he kissed her. But nothing was real. Nothing. After all, to him, she had never been anything but a game. She pulled a blanket over her body and closed her eyes, but sleep didn't come, because the truth was a sharp blade cutting deep into her soul. William Harrington hadn't just bought one night. He bought her trust, her desire, and then he destroyed it all. But one thing he couldn't take from her. Mary Johnson would never be a trophy of his bet. He may have won this game, but he would never see her bleed for it again. The smell of fresh coffee filled the air of La Plaza Cafe, but for Mary, the familiar scent brought no comfort. She moved mechanically behind the counter, focusing on filling cups and taking orders as if her life depended on it. The stares were everywhere. The other waitresses looked at her with a mix of curiosity and pity. The customers whispered, and even those who didn't know exactly what had happened seemed to realize that something was wrong. Mary pretended not to notice, pretending that she didn't feel her stomach churn every time someone quickly looked away as she passed. She just wanted the day to end. And then the door to the cafe opened. Mary didn't need to look. She knew the instant the air around her shifted. A silent tension spread through the room, the whispers ceased, and she felt his presence before even raising her eyes. William Harrington was there, and he seemed different. The impeccable, arrogant man who had challenged her days ago was now pale, his jaw clenched and his eyes dark. His perfectly tailored suit hid any signs of weakness, but something in his posture gave away that he wasn't there to play. The entire cafe watched. He walked up to the counter and stopped right in front of her. "We need to talk." His voice sounded firm, but there was something else in it, an urgency. Mary set the cup she was holding down and looked up at him. Her heart raced in her chest, but her expression remained cold. "You're lucky," she said, her voice thick with sarcasm. "The bet was won, right? You must feel victorious." William took a deep breath. "Mary, don't you dare say my name." She leaned slightly over the counter, her eyes shining with anger. "You won your bet, Harrington. I hope it was worth every penny." Her words echoed through the cafe, each syllable laced with venom. The silence around them was almost oppressive. Mary knew that everyone was listening, and she didn't care. William tried to move closer, but she took a step back. "I need you to listen." "Listen to what? More lies? More games?" He ran a hand through his hair, clearly frustrated. "I was wrong, Mary. I was an idiot. But you need to know that." "I don't need to know anything." She took off her apron and threw it on the counter without taking her eyes off him. "Leave and never contact me again." Then, without waiting for a response, she turned and walked out through the back door. The rain was falling heavily outside, soaking the street and chilling the air. Mary walked aimlessly, but she didn't have time to run. William was following her. Before she could react, she felt his hand grab her arm. "Mary, please!" She turned sharply, her face wet from the rain, her chest rising and falling quickly. "Let go of me!" William released her instantly but didn't step back. His wet hair stuck to his forehead, and his eyes had an intensity she didn't want to see. "It wasn't just a bet." The confession tore through him. "I was an idiot, yes, but what happened between us, it was real to me." Mary let out a bitter laugh. "Real?" She took a step back, as if needing distance to bear it. "None of this was real, William." His gaze turned icy. "You paid to have me for one night. Now get out of my life." She turned and walked back into the cafe without looking back. William stood there. The rain kept falling, soaking his suit, blending with the bitter taste of defeat. Hours later, the headlines appeared. William Harrington cuts ties with Thomas Wilson. Business scandal shakes financial empire. The bet had cost him more than he'd imagined, and this time he hadn't won. The words were everywhere. In the newspapers, on gossip websites, and in the morning TV shows. The scandal spread like an uncontrollable fire, and Mary was right at the center of the storm. At La Plaza Cafe, the customers no longer looked at her the same way. Some whispered, others stared at her as if she were a spectacle to be analyzed. There were those who took pictures without disguise, those who commented loudly enough for her to hear, and even some who tried to strike up a conversation, hoping she'd reveal some sordid detail of the story. She ignored them, or tried to. But the phone wouldn't stop ringing. Reporters called non-stop, offering money for interviews, trying to extract an exclusive statement. Her social media was flooded with messages from strangers, some offering support, most of them passing judgment. Luxury waitress. You sold yourself and now want to play the victim. Where's the bank account for more donations? Every word burned like acid. Mary just wanted to disappear, but she couldn't. The only thing that still made sense was her mother. When she arrived at the hospital that night, the place offered brief relief from the madness outside. But just looking at Susan Eleanor made the pain come rushing back with full force. "Daughter," her mother's soft tone made Mary collapse. She sat beside the bed, her eyes filled with tears. Susan Elena reached out with her fragile hand to touch her daughter's face, examining every weary feature. "What did they do to you?" Mary swallowed hard, forcing a trembling smile. "Nothing I can't handle." Were. Susan Elena squeezed her hand with the little strength she had left. "The money saved my life, Mary, but you paid a very high price." Hearing that hurt more than any cruel headline. Mary looked away, trying to hold back the tears. She didn't regret saving her mother, but was it worth carrying that mark forever? Meanwhile, William faced his own ruin. The boardroom of the Harrington Group, once a temple of control and power, was now a chaotic mess. Lawyers were arguing, shareholders were demanding answers, and his board of directors was already talking about removing him. Thomas Wilson didn't waste time distancing himself from the scandal, washing his hands of any involvement. The partnership between the two was dissolved. Investors questioned his morality, and the press tore him apart daily. But William didn't care about business. He didn't care about his public image. He only cared about Mary. He tried to reach her. Calls ignored, messages unanswered. The emptiness in his chest was a constant torment. For the first time in his life, William Harrington felt like he had lost something that no amount of money could buy. Days later, the hospital received an anonymous donation. The amount? Enough to cover all future expenses for Susan Elena, ensuring that she would never have to worry about treatments again. But Mary knew immediately who it was from. She stared at the email open on her laptop, her hands hovering over the keyboard. To William Harrington. Subject, why? The solitary question stared back at her, blinking on the screen. Why? Why had he done this? Out of guilt? Out of regret? Or because somehow he still cared? Her fingers trembled over the send button, but at the last second she erased the message and closed the laptop. William Harrington didn't deserve answers, and she didn't deserve more doubts. Mary's silence was her answer. She didn't reach out to William, didn't respond to his messages, didn't try to understand his motives. The anonymous donation spoke for itself, but the weight of the humiliation was still greater than any late gesture. He could try to buy her forgiveness, just like he did with his presence that night, just like he did when he bet that her dignity had a price. But Mary wasn't for sale. So she carried on with her life the only way she could, pretending he didn't exist. Days passed, but the buzz around the scandal didn't die down. At the cafe, people whispered every time she passed. Some looked at her with pity, others with judgment, some simply with the morbid curiosity of someone witnessing an accident they couldn't look away from. Mary tried to ignore it, but it was impossible, until the day the world stopped to hear William Harrington speak. It was Nicole who turned on the TV first. The sound of the press conference echoed through the small apartment as Mary took a sip of coffee, distracted. Only when she heard his name did her attention shift from the screen of her phone to the image everyone had been waiting to see. William was there, standing in front of a crowd of journalists, cameras flashing as if every word he said were a death sentence. The backdrop was the Harrington Group logo, but the imposing setting contrasted with William's expression. He didn't look like the same man. The dark, perfectly tailored suit was still there, as was his rigid posture, but something in him had changed. His gaze was no longer that of a businessman trying to save his reputation. It wasn't a man asking for forgiveness out of convenience. It was someone who had nothing left to lose. William took a deep breath before he began. "Yes, it was a bet," he said, and a murmur spread across the room. His voice was firm, but there was a vulnerability no one had expected to hear. "And it was the worst decision of my life." Mary felt a tightness in her chest. Nicole widened her eyes. "What's he doing?" she muttered. Mary didn't answer. On the screen, William appeared unshaken, but she knew him well enough to see that it wasn't true. "I could hide behind lawyers, deny everything, try to clean up my image. But the truth is, there's no defense for what I did." More flashes went off. Journalists whispered among themselves, hungry for every word. William licked his lips before continuing. The bet was real, but what happened after, that was real too. This time, there was no murmuring, just silence. The tension in the apartment grew. Mary felt the air around her grow heavier. William looked directly at the camera, as if speaking only to her. "I know my word doesn't mean much now. I know what I did is unforgivable, but if I lose everything for it, so be it." He took a deep breath, because what matters isn't money, it's her. Mary's eyes widened, her heart raced, but it was the next sentence that made the world stop. "Mary Johnson, you are the only thing in my life that has never had a price." The coffee cup Mary had been holding slipped from her fingers and spilled across the table, spreading across the wooden surface. She didn't move. The phone started vibrating non-stop. Messages, calls, notifications exploded, reporters, friends, even her mother. Nicole picked up the phone and read one of the messages aloud. "Did you see this? The guy just metaphorically knelt before you in front of the whole planet." The sound of the TV seemed distant, the noise around her fading into the chaos inside. "Mary!" Nicole called, but she was already lost in her own thoughts. Without saying another word, she stood up, grabbed her coat, and walked out the door. The night was cold in New York, and Mary walked aimlessly through the streets. The city was still alive, as always. Taxis cruised the streets, couples hurried by, groups of friends laughed loudly. The world kept turning, unaware of the storm within her. They stopped on a bridge where the view of Manhattan's skyline stretched before them. Mary squeezed William's hand lightly and looked at him. "Do you think we'll ever stop being that story people talk about?" William tilted his head, thoughtful. "I think people like happy endings." She laughed, shaking her head. "This isn't an ending." He smiled. "No, it's just the beginning." She turned back to the city. So much had happened there, so many pains, so many mistakes, so many twists that brought her to this moment. Nothing was easy, nothing was simple, but some things don't need to be. Some things can only be earned, not bought, not planned, not forced, and their love was one of them. William tightened his grip on her hand, and together they watched the city breathe around them, ready to write a new chapter. Time passed, But the weight of that story remained. A month after the press conference that made the world stop, Mary still felt the aftermath of the hurricane that William Harrington had caused in her life. The media no longer spoke about her as frequently. The customers at the cafe had stopped whispering when she passed, and the phone no longer rang with reporters desperate for an exclusive interview. But inside her, the storm hadn't fully subsided. She tried to move on. She tried to convince herself that everything was resolved. But sometimes, late at night, she found herself reliving the moments with William. The arrogance of their first meeting, the night at the Palanque Hotel, the bittersweet taste of betrayal. And then that man, the same one who had hurt her, breaking down in front of the world for her. She hated to admit it, but part of her still felt something, and that irritated her. That's why, on that Tuesday night when her phone vibrated, Mary felt something different. The screen lit up with a new message: William Harrington. La Plaza, Tuesday, 8 p.m. No contracts, no expectations. Simple, direct, no promises. Her heart raced, and before she could react, Nicole grabbed the phone from her hand. "Oh my God!" Nicole murmured, reading the message. She raised her eyes, studying Mary with a sharp look. "Are you going?" Mary bit her lower lip, hesitating. "I don't know." Nicole crossed her arms, serious. "If it's not for him, go for yourself, to finish this story the right way." Mary sighed and took the phone back. William's message seemed to scream at her from the screen. No contracts, no expectations. So why did it feel like such a loaded invitation? That Tuesday night, Mary stood in front of La Plaza Cafe. The lights were on, but the sign read "Closed." Through the glass, she could see the interior was empty. Only one table was set, 2 cups, a coffee pot, and William Harrington waiting for her. She hesitated. What was she doing there? Why didn't she just ignore the message and move on with her life? But the truth was, Mary needed answers. Not about William, but about herself. She pushed the door open slowly, the sound of the small bell ringing throughout the empty space. William looked up. He wasn't wearing an expensive suit, nor did he have the air of superiority he always carried. He was wearing a simple sweater and jeans. His hair was slightly messy. He looked like an ordinary man, but William Harrington would never be an ordinary man. When she approached, he stood up. "Thank you for coming." Mary stood still for a moment. "I still don't know why I'm here." William gave a small smile. "I know." She looked away, sitting down. William did the same. The silence between them was long, but not awkward, just full of unsaid things. He broke the silence. No apologies, no empty promises, just the truth. "I'm not a good man, Mary." He intertwined his fingers on the table, looking at her sincerely. "I've spent my life getting everything I wanted, buying, winning, betting." She swallowed hard. William continued. "But for the first time, I lost. And for the first time, that matters." She lowered her eyes to the coffee cup in front of her. "And what do you want from me now?" William took a deep breath. "I want you to listen to me." She remained silent, so he continued. He spoke about how he had left Thomas Wilson behind, how he had changed his company, how, for the first time, he was trying to be someone worth something. "But none of it matters without you." The words hung in the air between them. Mary felt the impact. Her heart was racing, but her mind screamed at her to be cautious. William Harrington was dangerous, not because of money, not because of power, but because he made her want to believe him. She took a deep breath and looked him in the eyes. "I can't just forget everything that happened." William nodded. "I don't expect you to." She studied every feature of his face. For the first time, she didn't see the man who destroyed her. She saw someone trying, really trying, to be different. But could she trust him again? She picked up the cup, brought it to her lips and said, finally, "Let's take it slow. No rush, no promises we can't keep." William watched her for a moment before giving a slight smile. Slow sounds perfect. The night was cold when William walked her to the door of her apartment. The weeks that followed their meeting at the cafe were a jumble of small moments. Carefree dinners, walks through New York, conversations that stretched until dawn. There was care, hesitation, as if both of them knew they were walking on thin ice. Neither wanted to break it. Mary couldn't deny that something inside her had changed. At first, she stayed alert, ready to find any sign that William would revert to the arrogant man who had hurt her. But he didn't. The William who sat beside her in Central Park, listening to her talk about her childhood in Mexico City, wasn't the same man who slid a business card across the counter as if she were just another market offer. The William who made her laugh with stories of his rebellious adolescence, who revealed insecurities he had once hidden behind a veil of power, wasn't the same man who bet with a shady partner that he could buy her. And now he was here, in front of her, his blue eyes filled with something that Mary didn't want to name. William took a deep breath. "May I kiss you?" The question came with a weight that went beyond the moment. He wasn't just asking for a kiss. He was asking for permission to cross a line that, until now, they had kept untouched. Mary felt her heart race. For so long, this moment had been loaded with pain, betrayal, and anger. But now she wanted to. She smiled faintly. Now, yes. William didn't hesitate. He gently cupped her face, as though he still couldn't believe he had the right to touch her. The kiss was slow, without urgency, different from anything they had ever shared. There was no rush, no possession. Just the certainty that, after everything, there was still something there, something real. Days later, Mary noticed something different in William. He seemed restless. He was always fiddling with his phone, making calls in a low voice, and would always look away when she asked if everything was okay. Until one night, he showed up at her door with an envelope in hand. "What's this?" she asked, suspicious. William hesitated for a moment before handing it to her. Mary opened it, finding inside a sale contract. Her name was there. William Harrington had sold his stake in the Harrington Group. She widened her eyes. "William, this is your empire." He smiled to the side, as if he had already expected this reaction. It was. But why? He ran a hand through his hair, breathing deeply before answering. "Because it wasn't mine anymore. Not the way I wanted it to be. I built that company with my father, but I realized that in the end, I was becoming exactly what I despised the most." He took a step closer, holding her hands. "And because I wanted to start over. Start over? At my own pace, in my own place." He pulled another envelope from his pocket. Inside, there was the deed to a house. "In Brooklyn," Mary read, surprised. William smiled. "A place to start over, with you if you want." Her heart raced. For a moment, the image of that future appeared before her eyes, a place far from the impersonal skyscrapers, far from the shadows of the past, far from bets and betrayals, but close to him. Mary took a deep breath, feeling an unexpected warmth grow inside her. "You're crazy." William laughed, a little, but this time for a good reason. She didn't respond. She just held his hand tighter. Maybe, just maybe, that fresh start was possible. Months later, Mary walked through the hospital corridors, feeling her heart race. This time it wasn't fear. It was anticipation. William walked beside her, visibly tense. "Are you nervous?" she teased. He ran a hand through his neck. "Not every day you meet the woman whose treatment you saved, but who would also slap you if you knew the original reason." Mary laughed. "Relax. I've already told her everything." He stopped in the middle of the corridor, his eyes wide. Everything? She winked, amused. Almost everything. Before William could protest, they reached the room. Susan Elena was sitting in bed, visibly stronger than months ago. Her eyes, identical to Mary's, sparkled when she saw her daughter. "Mom, I want to introduce you to someone." William entered hesitantly, but Susan Elena simply smiled, studying him for a moment. "So, you're the famous William Harrington?" "Yes, ma'am." She tilted her head. "You saved my daughter's life." William opened his mouth to deny it, but Susan Elena raised a hand, interrupting him. "And she saved yours." Silence filled the room, laden with meaning. William looked at Mary and she at him. And then they both smiled. That night, lying on the couch in their new apartment in Brooklyn, Mary felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. William traced soft circles on the palm of her hand, as though it had already become an unconscious habit. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. She turned to face him. "About us." He raised an eyebrow. "And what did you conclude?" She hesitated for a moment before asking, "And if we mess everything up?" William held her hand tighter. "Then we try again." She blinked in surprise. He smiled, "Because some things are worth it." Mary felt her heart tighten, not out of fear, but because for the first time she was sure that she wanted to try. She rested her head on his chest, feeling the rhythm of his breathing. Outside, New York sparkled around them, and Mary realized not everything can be bought, but some things can be rebuilt. And their love, despite everything, was one of them. The past doesn't disappear just because we decide to move on. The headlines might change, the journalists would find new scandals to explore, and the public's attention would shift to another recent shocking story. But the memories, they stayed. Mary knew this. She and William were trying, and for the first time, trying seemed enough. Life beside him was far from a fairy tale. It wasn't easy to rebuild something that had been born on a broken foundation. There were still curious glances on the streets, whispers from those who remembered the scandal, reporters who occasionally tried to resurrect the story. But Mary realized that other people's opinions weighed less than she had imagined. The real challenge wasn't on the outside, it was inside her. Some nights she woke up startled, haunted by the fear that all of this might be a mistake. Other times she felt a coldness in her chest as she realized how essential William had become in her life. One night, while they were lying on the couch, Mary looked out the window at the city. The lights flickered in the distance, reflecting off the glass, while William's calm breathing filled the silence of their apartment. She broke the stillness suddenly. "I'm still afraid." William turned his face to hers, his expression calm. "Afraid of what?" She thought for a moment before answering. "Afraid that one day I'll wake up and realize that all of this is just an illusion." He smiled slightly, reaching out to interlace his fingers with hers. "I'm afraid of that too." Mary stared at him, surprised. William took a deep breath before continuing. "But I think that's what makes it all real." She reflected on this. She had always thought that true love was certainty, an unshakable security. But maybe she had been wrong. Maybe love was exactly this. The daily choice to keep going, even when fear is present. She turned to face him, resting her chin on his chest. "A few months ago, I said dignity has no price." William gently ran his fingers through her hair. "I remember." She looked up at him. "Love doesn't have one either." He smiled. "Good thing. I wouldn't have enough money to pay for yours." She laughed, and the tension that had been lingering between them dissolved. Time passed, and one day, while they were walking through Brooklyn, William stopped in front of a small commercial space for sale. The old sign indicated that it had been a cafe years ago, but now the windows were covered with dust and the interior was empty. Mary looked at him, curious. "What is it?" William stood silent for a moment before speaking. "What if we started over?" She frowned. "What do you mean?" He pointed to the building. "A cafe, our cafe." Mary raised an eyebrow. "You want to open a cafe?" William smiled. "I want to open our cafe." The idea caught her off guard. Mary had never imagined William Harrington away from the corporate world, without expensive suits and business meetings involving millions. But there he was, proposing something completely new, something that wasn't about power, money, or status. It was about them. She looked back at the empty space in front of them, a new beginning, far from the shadows of the past, without labels. Just the two of them. Mary smiled. "I accept." And this time, there were no contracts, just a fresh start. The smell of fresh coffee filled the air at La Plaza Cafe, blending with the sound of conversations, laughter, and the clinking of cups against saucers. The place had always been busy, but that afternoon, there was something different. Mary noticed this when she looked around and saw familiar faces of regular customers, but also some strangers who seemed to be paying more attention to her than to the cafe itself. There were discreet smiles, curious glances, but no judgment. For the first time in a long time, no one whispered, no one stared at her as if waiting for a scandal. She glanced at William, who was sitting across from her, laughing at something Nicole had just said. His eyes sparkled, and his laughter was genuine, free. It was at that moment that Mary felt something shift. For so long she thought people would always look at them and see only the past, the bet, the betrayal, the scandal. But there, in that peaceful afternoon, she realized that the city was ready to see a new story. Someone, sitting at one of the nearby tables, took a photo. This time, it wasn't for a tabloid. It wasn't for a scandal. It was just a moment, captured in time. Two lovers, a couple that had survived chaos, smiling at each other as if the past had never existed. Later that night, as Mary and William walked slowly through the streets of New York, the biting wind against their faces, their hands intertwined, they stopped on a bridge where the skyline of Manhattan stretched out before them. Mary squeezed William's hand lightly and looked at him. "Do you think one day we'll stop being that story people talk about?" William tilted his head, thoughtful. "I think people like happy endings." She laughed, shaking her head. "This isn't an ending." He smiled. "No, it's just the beginning." She turned back to the city. So much had happened there. So many pains, so many mistakes, so many twists that brought her to that moment. Nothing was easy, nothing was simple. But some things don't need to be. Some things can only be earned, not bought, not planned, not forced. And their love was one of them. William squeezed her hand, and together they watched the city breathe around them, ready to write a new chapter.